the whole energy policy is a complete dog's breakfast. And everybody, not just households, but businesses in general are paying higher prices than they would otherwise have done for no obvious benefit to the environment or to poorer households.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Michael Simmons. Now, today Ofgem, the energy regulator, announced that from October, the average bill for gas and electricity is going to increase by 2%. Now, to discuss that, I'm delighted to be joined by Julian Jessop, the Economics Fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Julian, thanks very much for joining me. Spectator viewers are really interested in energy policy, energy security, and I know that they look at things like the wholesale price. And recently, the wholesale price of energy has been going down. So shouldn't the energy price cap be coming down as well?
Well, you're absolutely correct. If the price of energy was set in the free market, then prices would indeed be lower. Unfortunately, we've got a bit of a dog's breakfast in the way that energy bills are set in the UK. First of all, we've got an energy cap to begin with, which I think is a bad idea. So I'm sorry for Ofgem. They seem to have this almost impossible role of trying to replicate what a perfectly competitive market would produce in terms of energy prices. But layered on top of that, there's all sorts of government intervention, all sorts of subsidies and levies and so on that distort the market completely. So almost any number they come up is likely to be wrong. And I think that's certainly the case here. There are basically two reasons why energy bills are rising, despite the fact that the wholesale cost of energy is flat or falling. One is that the energy system is having to pay a lot more for what are called balancing charges. Now, these basically reflect the fact that we use a lot more renewables now, but the supply of renewables is not very predictable. There can be days where, of course, we get lots of wind or sun and we get lots of energy. Other days when we don't get a lot at all. So the national grid basically has to spend lots of extra money in balancing the supply of energy from day to day because of how many renewables we use. The second thing is a sort of using energy bills as a tool of social policy. So the government is extending something called the Warm Homes Discount, which isn't a bad idea. It's basically a subsidy to people on lower incomes to help them with their bills. But the way that this is paid for is there's an additional charge on everybody else's bill, which is not necessarily a sensible way to redistribute spending power from one group to another. So using energy bills as a tool of redistributing income is one of the reasons why our energy bills are higher for most people than would otherwise have been.
And you mentioned those balancing payments, which, as you explain, are essentially a cost of our desire to use renewable energy. Britain's energy is also, it's not just going up here, but relative to the rest of the world, we pay more for energy than anyone else. Is that also because of how we have to fund renewables?
Well, there are lots of factors contributing to that, but you're absolutely right to pick up on it as a major problem. The only country, any large economy with energy costs anywhere near as high as ours is Germany. And it's no coincidence that the UK and Germany have been some of the worst performing of the major economies over the last few years during this energy crisis. So it's hitting our competitiveness and, of course, particularly the competitiveness of UK manufacturing particularly hard. But it's having knock-on effects on lots of other industries that are facing not just higher energy bills, but other costs as well. So, for example, the food sector, hospitality, pubs and so on are paying higher energy bills at the same time as they're having to pay more for staff and for employer national insurance contributions and things like that. So high energy bills is a huge problem for the whole economy, not just to manufacturing. There are a number of reasons why our bills are higher than others. So I think the drive to net zero is an important part of that. It's not the only part, but at the moment we've got this crazy rush to decarbonise the electricity system by 2030. Now, I'm not an expert in the energy market, but I have yet to find one who thinks that target is sensible and achievable without huge costs in the meantime. So we're rushing to reach a target that's just going to cost enormous amounts of money. And of course, us achieving net zero by 2030 is going to make precisely no difference to what's happening in the world economy and to global climate change. So it's pointless self-flagellation, I think, more for ideological reasons for anything else. So the net zero agenda is part of it. There are other factors, though. We set industrial electricity prices in a rather strange way. So they're determined according to the marginal cost of the most expensive fuel at the time. So we tend automatically to have higher prices than anywhere else in Europe because we're automatically hit by whichever price happens to be highest. So
why do we do that? I mean, that just seems insane.
It does. I mean, the only economic argument for it is sort of incentivizes people to produce more energy because if they can sell a much higher price than they actually need in order to be profitable, then there's every incentive for them to ramp up supply. But that sort of assumes that supply is flexible, and it isn't actually that easy. I mean, if you look particularly at renewables, the supply of energy from renewables is erratic, and we've underinvested in things like battery storage and storage more generally. So we have big problems there. So there are a number of factors. If we go back a bit further, we've underinvested in nuclear. You may remember the famous quote from the Lib Dem leader not so long ago who said that there's no point in investing in nuclear because 10 years before it comes on stream. And 10 years later, that's precisely when we needed it, because that was in the midst of the energy crisis triggered by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So we've got a bad energy mix, not enough nuclear, too much reliance on renewables. And when we are buying fossil fuels, we seem to be shooting ourselves in the foot again by producing less fossil fuels, North Sea oil and gas than we could otherwise have done, and ending up importing them, not necessarily at a higher price, but often from less reliable sources in one way or another from the rest of the world. So the whole energy policy is a complete dog's breakfast. And everybody, not just households, but businesses in general are paying higher prices than they would otherwise have done for no obvious benefit to the environment or to poorer households.
And that energy policy, has been set by various governments for years and years, but Ed Miliband is the minister currently responsible for it. And, many people disagree with him, but he's clearly not a stupid man. He must know that the policy we're pursuing, causes economic harm for the reasons that you've outlined. Do you think these people are just so committed to a feeling that they need to save the world from climate change that they say, I don't care what the cost is to everyone else?
Well, there are two possible ways of rationalising it. One is exactly what you said, that they're sort of ideologically driven to do everything they can to fight climate change. Though ironically, as I say, what we do in the UK is pretty meaningless. We're responsible for of the order of 1% of global CO2 emissions, and to the extent that we just cripple our manufacturing industry, we're just driving more manufacturing to other countries which are less responsible than we are. So that's one possible explanation. A more benign explanation is that maybe he does genuinely believe that if you really set an ambitious target and drive the industry towards achieving it, then you get some short-term pain. But in the end, we end up with a highly efficient energy sector. We become a global leader in renewables and all that sort of thing. That's not a completely daft idea, but all the evidence, of course, is that is not working. Other countries have already gained that first mover advantage. China, ironically, in particular, is the world leader in renewables and related technology. So we're playing catch up, but on a timetable that is simply too fast. We're trying to decarbonise the grid by 2030. And as I say, I don't think anybody thinks that's realistic. And
returning to the energy, cap itself, which is a policy we've had for a number of years. Now, you're obviously a free marketeer, and you don't think, that prices should be controlled by the state. But when Russia invaded Ukraine and prices went up so high that the government felt it had no choice not just to cap them, but to, completely subsidize the costs. What actually is the alternative? Because we can't have millions of people who can't, turn the lights on or heat their homes.
Well, I think there are two things you have to do. I mean, first of all, I do recognise that there is a genuine problem with climate change, or at least pollution more generally. And it's very important that the prices that people pay reflect all of the costs, including the social and environmental costs. So if that means there are additional carbon taxes applied to energy generated from certain more polluting sources, then so be it. But beyond that, I would leave it pretty much to the markets to decide which forms of energy to produce. And if the market, faced with the economically appropriate prices, decides that more nuclear is the solution, or more wind, or more solar, or more oil and gas, then I'm perfectly happy to let the markets work that out. The second thing, though, is, as you say, what happens when there is a massive surge in energy prices? And even then, I would then, of course, want to protect the people who are most vulnerable. The question, though, is how you do it. There is a danger that if you cap energy prices for everybody, then you remove the incentive for those people who can save on their bills to do so. So you don't want to be in a situation where people aren't facing the reality that there's a shortage of energy and that prices are a lot higher. You want to encourage people to reduce demand where they can. So the economically correct response then is to top up the incomes of poorer households. And if they want to spend some of that subsidy on energy, that's fine. But then they still got the incentive to save on energy, which wouldn't be the case if their bills were kept very, very low. So the solution there, as I say, is not for the government to intervene and cap prices, but instead to top up the incomes of the most vulnerable and give them the opportunity to make savings on their energy bills, or to use the money for other things if they want.
And on that very point about, encouraging those who can to reduce demand because they have to hit higher costs, if you look at kind of that factor not being in the economy for the last few years, but also just the energy cap going up today, the price rises in general, do these combine to create an inflationary problem for us? I mean, the Bank of England's convinced that inflation is going to peak at 4% and then dip away again. But does that, track with what we're seeing in energy as an example of an important part of the economy?
Well, I think it's important here to distinguish between the level of energy prices and the rate of inflation. The rate of inflation in energy is actually going to fall, despite the announcement of the increase in the Ofgem cap. And that's because the increase in October this year of 2% is significantly less than the increase in October 2024, which was 10%. So energy inflation will still fall sharply in October this year. And that's one of several reasons why I think inflation will peak before then, possibly in August, but perhaps more likely now in September because of rising food prices. So we're still going to get inflation falling. But that's no consolation, of course, if inflation is falling, but energy prices are still very high. So the level of energy prices is the really big problem. As far as the Bank of England is concerned, of course, then there's nothing that monetary policy can do about energy prices directly. So they would only be worried if higher energy prices were having what we economists call second round effects on the economy. And in particular, if they were leading to people raising their expectations for inflation and perhaps demanding bigger wage increases as well. So an initial increase in inflation due to higher food and energy prices gets baked into the system. And that's certainly a risk. And that's one reason why the interest rate decision at the last meeting was so tight, with 4 of the 9 members actually voting to leave rates on hold. But I think there are good reasons to think that those second round effects are going to fade. In particular, the labour market, of course, is now cooling pretty rapidly. And most people are going to get much lower pay increases over the next year or so than they might have done in the last couple of years. And inflation expectations have already also remained fairly well anchored as well. So even if I'm wrong and headline inflation remains a little bit higher for longer, as long as it's due to these temporary factors around food and energy, then I think the Bank of England will be right to continue to look through that and keep cutting interest rates.
And finally, if Keir Starmer's government is to have any chance at all of making it to a second term, it's going to have to seriously kickstart growth by getting industry going again. Does it have any chance at all of achieving that with its current energy policy?
Well, I simply don't see how it can. One of the biggest obstacles to keeping a business going or starting a new one in the UK is the very high level of energy costs. That's particularly important if you're a sort of internationally mobile manufacturing company. Why on earth would you want to pay the much higher energy bills that we have here? There are some people who support the net zero agenda who would say that, well, net zero is creating lots of good, high-paying jobs. But that's not really a sensible way of looking at it, because, of course, there are lots of jobs in in existing energy industries like North Sea oil and gas that are good jobs, that are high paying. So all you're really doing is shuffling one type of job from one sector or one type of activity to another. So there's no real evidence that just more green jobs in itself is a boon to the economy. Instead, you need to think about creating the conditions in which businesses of any type can thrive. And that means that you need energy prices that are set at a sensible level that simply reflect the appropriate costs, including social costs, but then let the markets get on with it. But that's very much the opposite of the way that this government is approaching the energy market, and of course, almost the entire economy. That this government believes that the government knows best, and more intervention is better than less.
Julian, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.